The elevator hummed softly as it ascended, the steady rhythm a stark contrast to the tension coiling in the small space. I shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the mirrored walls that reflected my boss, Adrian, standing just a step away. His usual polished demeanor was intact, suit perfectly tailored, tie immaculately knotted, but there was an unusual air about him tonight, something I couldn't quite place. We were the last two people in the office, a rare occurrence in itself. Adrian rarely stayed late, and I usually avoided lingering to prevent any interactions beyond the necessary professional exchanges. Yet here we were, trapped in this strangely intimate bubble. Adrian cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Late night for you, Jonah?" I nodded, gripping my bag tighter. "Just finishing up some reports. Didn't realize you were still here." He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough to reveal the sharpness of his features. "Neither did I, but I saw your light on and thought I'd check in." It was such a simple statement, but the way he said it made my stomach twist. His tone was casual, but his eyes, those piercing gray eyes, lingered on me a beat too long. I felt exposed, as if he could see past the layers of polite professionalism I'd carefully maintained since joining his team. "That's considerate of you," I managed, my voice betraying the nervous flutter building in my chest. The elevator chimed softly, signaling our steady ascent. Adrian shifted, leaning slightly against the wall, his posture more relaxed than I'd ever seen. "You're good at what you do, Jonah," he said, his gaze steady. "I've noticed." Heat crept up my neck, and I hoped the dim lighting hid the flush threatening to color my cheeks. "Thank you. I try my best." "You do more than that." His voice was lower now, softer, but it carried weight. "I don't say it enough, but I appreciate your hard work." Something in his tone made me look up, and when our eyes met, the air between us shifted. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A charge, a spark I couldn't ignore. My breath hitched, and I quickly glanced away, my heart hammering in my chest. The elevator jolted suddenly, and the lights flickered. We both tensed as it came to an abrupt halt. "What the?" Adrian muttered, pressing the button for the next floor. Nothing happened. He tried the emergency button, but the same unsettling stillness filled the space. "Great, looks like we're stuck." I swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. Trapped. Alone. With him. Adrian sighed, running a hand through his impeccably styled hair. It was the first time I'd seen him look even slightly disheveled, and for some reason the sight sent a strange thrill through me. He turned toward me, his expression calm despite the inconvenience. "Well, I guess we'll have to wait it out," he said, leaning back against the wall. His tone was casual, but his presence filled the small space, making it hard to breathe. I nodded, shifting awkwardly. My bag dangled uselessly from my hand, and I clutched it like a lifeline, unsure of what to do with myself. "Yeah, hopefully, it's not too long." Adrian's eyes lingered on me, sharp and assessing. "You're nervous," he observed, his voice tinged with curiosity. "No, I'm not," I lied, though the tremor in my voice gave me away. He smirked, a faint curve of his lips that made my heart stutter. "You always fidget when you're uncomfortable. I've noticed that about you." My breath caught, and I forced myself to look anywhere but at him. The mirrored walls reflected his relaxed posture, the ease with which he commanded the space, even now. He loosened his tie slightly, the motion casual, but it drew my attention to the hollow of his throat. I tore my gaze away, cursing myself for the thoughts creeping into my mind. "You notice a lot," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I do," he admitted, his tone softer now. "I can't help it." The confession hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I dared a glance at him, and the intensity in his gaze sent a shiver down my spine. There was something unguarded in his expression, something I hadn't seen before. "You're a mystery, Jonah," he continued, his voice low and measured. "You keep your head down, do your work, and then disappear as if you're afraid of being seen. Why is that?" His question caught me off guard, and I struggled to find an answer. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice shaking slightly. "I guess I just don't want to draw attention to myself." Adrian tilted his head, studying me as though trying to piece together a puzzle. "You don't realize how much attention you already draw." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt my face heat. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. My mind raced, trying to process the meaning behind his statement. "I've seen the way you handle yourself in meetings," he went on, his tone thoughtful. "The way you listen, the way you speak when you do. There's something compelling about you." Compelling. The word sent a jolt through me, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to say something, anything, but the lump in my throat made it impossible. Adrian took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. The space between us shrank, and the air grew thick with tension. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the scent of his cologne, earthy and subtle, wrapping around me. "Do I make you uncomfortable?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." Number I didn't know how to answer. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, but my body betrayed me, leaning ever so slightly toward him. "No," I said finally, the word trembling on my lips. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver through me. "Good," he said, his voice steady. "Because that's the last thing I want." The elevator seemed impossibly small now, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of myself I barely recognized. Wide-eyed, breathless, caught in the pull of something I couldn't resist. Adrian's gaze held mine, his expression unreadable but charged with something that made my chest tighten. "Jonah," he said softly, his voice wrapping around my name like a promise. "If I'm wrong, tell me to stop." He was so close now, his presence overwhelming. I could feel the warmth of his breath, see the faint stubble on his jaw. My lips parted, but no words came. I didn't want him to stop. Adrian seemed to take my silence as an answer. He leaned in slowly, his hand brushing against my cheek. The moment his lips met mine, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The kiss was tentative at first, testing, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But when I didn't, he deepened it, his hand slipping to the back of my neck to pull me closer. I melted into him, my hands clutching his shirt as though afraid he might disappear. The kiss was everything I hadn't known I needed. Soft and commanding, tender and electric. It was as if he'd unlocked something inside me, something I'd kept buried for far too long. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, our foreheads resting together as the tension ebbed and flowed between us. "I've wanted to do that for longer than I care to admit," Adrian confessed, his voice barely audible. I looked up at him, my heart still racing. "Why didn't you?" He smiled faintly, his thumb brushing against my jaw. "Because you're my employee. Because I didn't know if you felt the same." I hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. This was dangerous, uncharted territory. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew there was no going back. "I do," I said quietly. "I feel the same." The relief in his expression was palpable, and he kissed me again, this time with more urgency. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. My fingers tangled in his hair, and I felt a thrill at the soft groan that escaped him. The elevator jerked suddenly, breaking the moment. We pulled apart, both of us startled, as the lights flickered back on. The hum of the motor signaled our descent, and reality came crashing back in. Adrian stepped back, his hand slipping from my waist but not completely letting go. His expression was unreadable now, his walls coming back up. "This doesn't have to change anything," he said, his voice steady. "Unless you want it to." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I don't regret it." "Neither do I," he said softly, his fingers brushing mine one last time before he stepped back. The elevator doors slid open, and the world beyond seemed impossibly bright. We exchanged a brief glance, a silent understanding passing between us, before stepping out into the lobby. The tension still hummed between us, but it was tempered now, softened by the promise of something more. As I walked to my car, my mind replayed every moment in the elevator, every touch, every word. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I felt like I'd taken a step towards something real. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, my mind still a tangle of thoughts and emotions from the night before. The memory of Adrian's touch, his lips on mine, lingered like a phantom, both thrilling and unnerving. I couldn't help but wonder how he would act today, whether the moment we'd shared in the elevator had shifted something irreparably between us. I sat at my desk attempting to focus on the emails flooding my inbox, but every sound in the hallway made my heart race. When I finally heard his voice, a deep, commanding tone that always carried effortlessly over the chatter, I froze. He was greeting someone, his words clipped but polite, and I couldn't resist glancing up as he passed by my desk. Adrian didn't look at me, but the slight pause in his step as he walked by was enough to send my thoughts spiraling. Was he deliberately avoiding eye contact, or was I imagining things? I let out a shaky breath, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I forced myself to focus on work. The morning dragged on, each hour stretching endlessly. By lunchtime, I was practically vibrating with nervous energy. I decided to grab a coffee from the break room, hoping the short walk would clear my head. But as I rounded the corner, I nearly collided with Adrian. "Jonah," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes betraying a flicker of surprise. "Adrian," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. The use of his first name felt strange on my tongue, intimate in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. He hesitated, his gaze darting briefly to the empty hallway behind me before settling on my face. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice lower now, softer. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, but I nodded. "Of course." He gestured toward his office, and I followed him, every step feeling heavier than the last. When we entered, he closed the door quietly behind us, the soft click of the latch echoing in the stillness. Adrian leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms as he regarded me. The usual mask of professionalism he wore so effortlessly was absent now, replaced by something raw and unguarded. "About last night," he began, his voice careful. "I don't want you to think I regret it." Relief washed over me, and I felt my shoulders relax slightly. "I don't regret it either," I said, my voice firm despite the nervous flutter in my stomach. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips, but it quickly faded. "That being said, I know this is complicated. You're my employee, Jonah. I have a responsibility to maintain boundaries, and I crossed one last night." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I care about you," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "More than I should, more than is appropriate. But I need to know if this is something you want too, because if it is, I'm willing to figure it out. Together." The sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability etched into his expression, left me speechless. I hadn't allowed myself to fully consider what I wanted until now, too caught up in the whirlwind of emotions he'd stirred in me. But as I stood there, looking at him, I realized the answer was clear. "I do want this," I said quietly. "I don't know what it means or how we'll navigate it, but I know I don't want to pretend it didn't happen." Adrian's shoulders relaxed, and a hint of a smile returned to his face. That's all I needed to hear. The tension in the room shifted, softening as he stepped closer. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine in a gesture so simple yet so charged that it made my breath hitch. "If at any point you feel uncomfortable, Or if this becomes too much, you tell me. Promise me that." "I promise," I said, my voice steady despite the rapid pounding of my heart. His hand lingered on mine for a moment longer before he stepped back, giving me space. "We'll take it slow," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "No rushing, no pressure." I nodded, grateful for his understanding. The moment felt significant, a tentative step into something neither of us fully understood but were willing to explore. The rest of the day passed in a blur, the weight of our conversation settling over me like a warm blanket. Adrian and I exchanged glances throughout the day, small, fleeting moments that spoke volumes. It was as if a new understanding had been forged between us, unspoken but undeniable. A week later, we found ourselves working late again. The office was quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by the soft rustle of papers and the occasional click of a keyboard. Adrian's door was open, and I could see him at his desk, his sleeves rolled up and his tie discarded. The sight of him like that, so casual, so at ease, made my chest tighten. I forced myself to focus on the spreadsheet in front of me, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. Every glance, every word we'd exchanged over the past week played in my mind like a loop, each moment building on the last. The tension between us hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown, simmering just beneath the surface. "Jonah," his voice called from his office, breaking my reverie. I stood quickly, smoothing my shirt as I walked toward him. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening. "I could use a second opinion on this," he said, gesturing to his computer screen. I stepped closer, leaning over his desk to read the document. His presence beside me was overwhelming, his cologne subtle but intoxicating. I could feel the heat radiating from him, and it took every ounce of willpower not to let my body betray me. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice low, close to my ear. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus. "I think it's concise, but you might want to elaborate on this section," I said, pointing to the paragraph in question. Adrian leaned closer, his shoulder brushing against mine. The contact sent a shiver through me, and I held my breath, afraid he might notice. He didn't move away, his focus remaining on the screen, but his proximity made it impossible to think straight. "Good point," he murmured, his tone thoughtful. "I'll rework that." I straightened, stepping back to put some distance between us. My heart was racing, and I felt heat rising to my cheeks. Adrian glanced up at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Jonah," he said softly, his voice almost hesitant. "Are we okay?" The question caught me off guard, and I struggled to find the right words. "Yeah," I said finally. "Why wouldn't we be?" He smiled faintly, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Just making sure." The moment stretched between us, charged and fragile. I wanted to say more, to bridge the gap between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I gave him a small nod and turned to leave. "Jonah," he called after me, and I stopped, my hand hovering over the door handle. "Thank you." "For what?" I asked, glancing back at him. "For being you," he said simply, his eyes holding mine. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I wanted to respond, to tell him how much those words meant to me, but my throat tightened and I could only nod before slipping out of his office. My mind raced as I returned to my desk, his voice echoing in my head. "Thank you for being you." The next hour was a haze of half-hearted attempts to focus on work, my thoughts constantly drifting back to Adrian. I felt his presence even from across the office, an invisible tether pulling me toward him. When I finally shut my laptop and gathered my things, I noticed his office light was still on. My steps faltered as I passed his door, and I glanced inside. He was leaning back in his chair, his tie still discarded, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. His gaze lifted as he noticed me lingering, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Heading out?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. "Yeah," I replied, gripping the strap of my bag tighter. "Just finished up." Adrian hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "Do you have a moment? There's something I wanted to talk to you about." I nodded, my heart pounding as I stepped into his office. He motioned for me to close the door, and I complied, the soft click of the latch sending a shiver down my spine. When I turned back, he was standing now, his hands resting on the edge of his desk as he leaned slightly forward. "You've been on my mind," he admitted, his voice low. The confession was simple, but it felt like the ground beneath me had shifted. "And I don't just mean since the elevator." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. "Adrian." He raised a hand, silencing me gently. "Let me finish," he said, his tone soft but insistent. I've tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that what I feel is inappropriate, that it crosses a line I shouldn't even approach. But the truth is, I can't stop thinking about you, Jonah. I don't want to. His words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment all I could do was stare at him. The vulnerability in his expression, the quiet intensity in his voice. It was too much, yet not enough. I felt a knot of emotion rising in my chest, a mix of fear, hope, and something I couldn't yet name. "Say something," he urged, his gaze never leaving mine. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice trembling. This feels impossible." "It doesn't have to be," he said, stepping closer. His movements were deliberate, careful, as if he didn't want to startle me. "We can take it one step at a time, but only if you want to." I searched his face, looking for any hint of doubt or hesitation, but there was none. He was offering me something I hadn't realized I wanted until now, something I was terrified to reach for. But as I stood there, the weight of his words settling over me, I realized I couldn't turn away. "I do," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want this. I want you." Relief washed over his features and he closed the remaining distance between us. His hand reached out, brushing against mine before sliding up to cup my cheek. His touch was warm, grounding, and when he leaned in, I didn't hesitate. Our lips met in a kiss that was slow and deliberate, a quiet exploration that spoke of everything we hadn't said. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melt into him, my arms wrapping around his shoulders as if they belonged there. The kiss deepened, and I felt the world fall away, leaving only us. His hands slid up my back, his touch firm yet gentle, and I clung to him, afraid to let go. When we finally broke apart, our breaths mingling in the small space between us, he rested his forehead against mine. "This feels right," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "It does," I agreed, my hands still gripping his shirt. "But what happens now?" "We figure it out," he said, his thumb brushing against my jaw. "Together." The certainty in his voice settled something deep within me, and I nodded, a small smile breaking through the tension. "Okay," I said. "Together." The following weeks were a delicate balancing act. Adrian and I maintained our professional boundaries in the office, careful not to draw attention, but the stolen moments we shared told a different story. A lingering glance in a meeting, the brush of his hand against mine in passing, the way his eyes softened when he looked at me. It was a quiet, secret world we'd created, one that felt both thrilling and fragile. After hours, everything was different. The walls we built during the day came down, replaced by an openness that took my breath away. We talked for hours, about work, about life, about everything and nothing. Adrian's guarded demeanor faded in those moments, revealing a depth I hadn't known existed. And with every word, every touch, I found myself falling deeper. One evening, as we lay tangled together on his couch, the glow of the city lights streaming through the windows, I turned to him, my chest tight with emotion. "Why me?" I asked softly, my fingers tracing lazy patterns on his arm. He looked at me, his expression unreadable for a moment before he spoke. "Because you see me," he said simply. "Not the boss, not the title, just me." His words struck a chord deep within me, and I felt my throat tighten. "I think I've always seen you," I admitted, my voice barely audible. Adrian's hand cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly, "but I'm going to do everything I can to be worthy of this. Of us." "You already are," I whispered, leaning in to kiss him. The kiss was slow, deliberate, a reflection of everything we couldn't put into words. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I felt a warmth spread through me, filling the spaces I hadn't realized were empty. In that moment, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Adrian's apartment became our sanctuary, a place where we could exist without pretense. The walls of professionalism and restraint that defined our work lives melted away the moment the door clicked shut. Here, we were just two people finding solace in each other. The nights stretched long and intimate, filled with whispered conversations, laughter, and touches that left my skin humming. One night, as rain pattered softly against the windows, we sat together on his bed. Adrian leaned against the headboard, his shirt unbuttoned and sleeves rolled up, while I rested against his chest, his arm draped around my shoulders. The soft glow of the bedside lamp cast a golden hue over the room, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. "You make everything feel lighter," Adrian said, his voice low and thoughtful. His fingers traced slow, deliberate patterns along my arm. "Work, life, all the stress, it fades when I'm with you." I tilted my head to look at him, my chest tightening at the vulnerability in his expression. "I could say the same about you," I admitted. "You've surprised me." "Surprised you?" he asked, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "In more ways than I can count," I said, my tone teasing but sincere. "You're not what I expected. At first I thought you were all business, no room for anything else, but now I see so much more." Adrian's smile softened, and he leaned down to press a kiss to my forehead. "You make me want to be more," he said quietly. "For you." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I hadn't expected this depth of connection, this raw honesty, but I welcomed it, let it fill the spaces I hadn't realized were empty. "I'm not going anywhere," I said softly, my hand resting over his heart. "Whatever this is, I'm in it with you." His hand covered mine, his grip firm yet gentle. "And I'm with you," he said, his voice steady, "every step of the way." The balance we'd struck between work and our private lives was delicate, and some days were harder than others. A lingering glance across a conference table, a brush of hands during a quiet moment in the break room, each interaction was charged, but we were careful. For all the risks, the quiet thrill of being together, of sharing something so profoundly ours, outweighed the challenges. But one evening, that delicate balance was tested. The office was nearly empty, most of the staff having left hours ago. I stayed late to finish a project, the hum of the air conditioning and the soft tapping of my keyboard, the only sounds in the quiet space. I didn't expect Adrian to still be there, but when his voice broke the silence, I froze. "Jonah," he said, his tone low and unreadable. I looked up to see him standing in the doorway of my office, his jacket slung over his arm and his tie slightly loosened. "Still working?" "Just wrapping up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The sight of him, so casually undone, sent my thoughts spiraling. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The click of the latch felt louder than it should have, and the tension in the room thickened. "I've noticed you've been putting in a lot of extra hours lately," he said, his gaze steady. "I just want to make sure everything's perfect," I replied, my hands fidgeting with the papers on my desk. "For you." Adrian's expression softened, and he took a step closer. "Jonah, everything you do is more than perfect." The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten, and I looked away, unsure of how to respond. But before I could say anything, He was standing beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "You don't have to work so hard to prove yourself to me," he said gently. "You're already more than enough." The vulnerability in his words, the quiet intensity of his gaze, left me breathless. I felt the world tilt as he leaned down, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft yet insistent. My hands moved of their own accord, gripping the front of his shirt as I pulled him closer. "Adrian," I murmured against his lips, my voice trembling with equal parts desire and uncertainty. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine. "Tell me if this is too much," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Tell me to stop." I shook my head, my fingers tightening in his shirt. "Don't stop." That was all the permission he needed. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me out of my chair and into his arms. The office around us faded into the background as he kissed me deeply, his touch igniting a fire that burned away every doubt, every fear. My back hit the edge of the desk and I clung to him, lost in the intensity of the moment. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, Adrian rested his hands on either side of me, his gaze locked onto mine. "I don't want to hide this anymore," he said, his voice firm. "Not with you." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt a swell of emotion I couldn't contain. "Neither do I admitted, my voice trembling. "But I'm scared." Adrian cupped my face, his thumbs brushing away the tears I hadn't realized had fallen. "I'll protect you," he said, his voice steady. "No matter what, I'll protect us." His promise, so simple yet so profound, broke something inside me. I leaned into him, my forehead resting against his chest as I let the tears fall. He held me tightly, his arms a safe haven in the storm of emotions I'd been carrying. For the first time, I felt truly seen, truly understood, and in that moment, I knew I could face anything, as long as he was by my side.